Hello, this is Dr. Josh Swamidas. I am a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm the founder of Peaceful Science. I'm a biologist, and I'm also the author of The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Here at Peaceful Science, we really want to bring together people from different worldviews, from different points of view, to really think about science and how it engages the grand question of what it means to be human. And there's probably no more controversial space. Well, there probably is, because life is controversial, but there's probably a few things as controversial as talking about race. But there's also a few things that really intersect across the science and the history and the philosophy of that grand question of what it means to be human, of considering whether or not there's different biological types of humans, whether or not they should be understood differently, from different points of view, and how, and whether or not we all have the same worth and dignity. And that is really hitting us now, even in really basic things about how do we handle the death of a person. Do we grieve that person's death, or do we try and co-opt it into a narrative? Do we humanize them or not? And so in that moment, we want to have a humanizing conversation about race. I'm a biologist. I've looked at the science of this, and race is complex. And I'm really pleased to have found and be able to bring Dr. Quayshawn Spencer into this conversation. Dr. Spencer is a professor, an associate professor of philosophy of biology. There's not very many philosophers of biology, actually, at University of Pennsylvania. It's a leading secular institution. And he has written quite a bit about the meaning of race and whether or not race is real. There's two articles in particular you'll find in the comments, if you click through those links, that he wrote that I thought were really interesting, where he looks at race from a biological point of view and race from a folk point of view, and tries to make sense about whether or not race is real. So thanks for being here with us, Dr. Spencer.
No, thanks for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background before we jump into this, and why we should care what you have to say about this?
Well, I'm not that different from you, actually. I was really in love with science growing up. Grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and did the whole pre-med thing. Actually did science fair. We all had to do it, but I kind of took it to the extreme. Won biochemistry senior year in the state. Headed to do the MD PhD in college, and then basically I was introduced to philosophy. And I realized that philosophy was just a bigger interest. But I never lost the science bug because I did philosophy of science. Went on to double major chemistry and philosophy in undergrad, and then did a master's in biology in graduate school, and then did the PhD in philosophy.
So philosophy of biology, the majority of philosophers of science are deeply engaged with physics, from what I've seen.
That's right. Yeah.
What percentage of philosophers of science are kind of physics oriented versus biology oriented? And of course, I think the lowest has got to be chemistry. Barely anyone does chemistry, right?
Well, it's funny because at Penn we have two people who have background in chemistry, me and Michael Weisberg. So it seems a little bit different in our department, but
you do philosophy of chemistry?
A little bit, working on like biochemical kinds and what is a protein, things like that. But no, yeah, I mean it's mostly physicists because
is it like around like 10-1, 5-1, or what?
Oh, nobody knows. Philosophers aren't as good as maybe some other disciplines in keeping those kind of records. But I mean, if you just look at like job ads, you're going to be getting a job as a philosopher of science, as a philosopher of biology, or a philosopher of physics for the most part. There's not really any ads for like chemistry.
So I think biology is an interesting place to focus, because I think that's actually where a lot of really hard questions arise, where even biologists are struggling with language about things like, homology or what is a species is a major debate, right? and of course that question of what a species is and what a kind is, we can kind of think about them as like esoteric questions about evolution or creation or whatever, but really they become very personal when we start talking about the human species, right?
Not just personal. I mean, it's a practical issue, right?
So if
you wanted to re-identify members of the same species, right? So you sampled at one point in time, and you want to make sure you're sampling from the same species at a different point in time. You need to have some criterion of what a species is, right? And that's a problem that paleontologists run into a lot, right? And it's a problem that, scientists in life sciences who are working in non-human sort of realms run into a lot, like unicellular, organisms, right? Where things can get really weird, right? In terms of just what an individual is, much less what a species is. So, no, I think it's like the best sort of philosophy of science is the philosophy of science that's engaging with the problems on the ground of practicing scientists.
And you've really written a lot about the biology, or like the philosophy of race, right?
Yes, yeah. That's basically why I got into philosophy. So
wait, I'm curious, how many Black philosophers of biology have written about race?
Well, probably a lot.
You said there's like 5 of you. Did all of you do it, or are you only one?
Well, if you condition it like that, there's probably a lot. Like there's Kofi Maglo at Cincinnati, and but in terms of philosophers of biology, then you're going to get a lower proportion. In terms of philosophers, you can get a lower proportion.
No, I mean like philosophers of biology who've written about race.
Oh, philosophers of biology, yeah, but philosophers of biology who are Black, that's a different story. But philosophers of biology, not as many as you might hope, especially given how important the subject of race has been in the history of biology, since the discipline started, really. In the first International Journal of Science, Journal of Scholars, was developed in the 17th century. Within the first 20 years of the first issue to publication, you had a paper on race. It was from Francois Bernier, 1684. And from then on, I mean, you really didn't get a sort of a drop off in race research in the life sciences until, bad stuff started happening. Bad stuff started happening pretty early, actually, but sort of, the Nazi involvement in race science and all that stuff in the 20th century, really. It was going strong, 1800s, 1700s, early 1900s.
It's interesting to me because, like, in our biology education, and this is actually one of the reasons I wanted you to come, both for our audience, but honestly for me. I mean, I'm a scientist who's engaging the public, and I want to talk about race in a responsible way.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that struck me, especially as I was doing research for my book and in other ways too, is how little we discuss the science of race in our biology educations. It's bizarre.
Now.
It's bizarre how little we talk about it, and then you kind of get to the end of it, and there's actually quite a bit of work that's been done on this that's really high quality, really interesting. It's non-intuitive and it's surprising, and most biologists it's never been part of our training, and most medical doctors it hasn't been part of our training. That's very surprising to me. And when you get right down to it, there's also, I think, a lot of difficulty we have as scientists about even talking in coherent ways about race, because we kind of hit up on a lot of challenging questions that come up here. And then, of course, this is a minefield. Who knows? Maybe I'm going to get nailed to the wall because I'm going to say something stupid today.
and that's, I think that has that's a big reason as to why it doesn't get a lot of attention today. Because I mean, it's too taboo in the life sciences, right? We just let the humanities handle that now, right? Or the social sciences. Right?
Yeah, but see, I'm of the opinion that I think science has something to add to it. And one thing I actually really benefited from your articles is that you really did a good job of explaining the recent dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
I know Alan Templeton, actually. He's here at Washington University.
Right.
And it was really, I mean, I don't know if you've talked to him yet, but it's worth sitting down and hearing from him.
Oh no, yeah. I know Alan. Yeah, I had a conference that I organized when I used to work in California, and it was I actually organized it for the Bay Area biosystematists because I was really involved with that. I like interdisciplinary philosophy, and so we had some philosophers and some biologists and some philosopher biologists. So Massimo Pigliucci has like 2 doctorates in the life sciences, one in genetics, one in biology, something like that, and a philosophy PhD. And so he was our philosopher biologist, and Templeton was our biologist, and we had a philosopher. I think it was Lisa Gannett, I think. But yeah, we got them all together. He actually had a paper that came out that really revised his theory of biological race in a special issue of Studies of History, Philosophy of Science, Part C, which I edited.
Well,
so that's his current.
I'd love to actually
position.
get that link. We'll put it actually for all the stuff that you're referencing. Any links you can give me. I mean, a lot of the people who listen in, or it can be a small audience, but there's a lot of us are academically oriented. We really want to kind
engage,
of take down those references and read them. But let's get to this big question that we have. Is biological race, or is race real? And your answer is a bit controversial, but I think it might be correct. It's kind of the difficult answer. I think your answer is it depends on what we mean by race. And that's it's funny. I posted this on a forum and I got some interesting comments. Like the first response that several scientists gave, biologists, was like, wow, this really seems like a dangerous approach.
Right. Well,
saying it depends about the reality of race, dangerous, Quayshawn.
I'm used to that. So we have to back up. So I mean, that, from reading my stuff, there's more than one race debate going on, right? So and this is one of the sort of background. There's always these background arguments in academia, right? And one of them is like, so whose meaning of race are we focused on, right? And the social scientists and the humanists, we're mostly interested in what ordinary people are talking about, right? Because that's like directly.
You call it the folk definition.
Right? I call it the folk, right? That's what's relevant to, what the cops are going to be using, what's going to be used in affirmative action, things like that. But then you have this long tradition among life scientists, right? It's like, what are you talking about? We started talking about race way before you guys, right? I just talked about Bernier back in 1600s. And they're talking about subspecies and ecotypes, and these are different ways of talking about race.
You can go back to La Pereire, right?
Yeah. So if you don't start with that sort of semantic clarification, then I think you just don't have a hope to really answer this question.
So let's kind of lay down the basis here. I think you would agree with what most scientists say, is that if there is any reality to race, it doesn't map to the folk understanding of race in a simple way, and it doesn't justify racism. It doesn't really give you different levels of humanness or anything that would justify different rights, and it's not even really clean categories. You'd agree with all of that, right?
Some of it. So,
okay, so tell me.
So again, depending on the sort of meaning that you're focused on, right? So if you're talking about biological subspecies, right, then a lot of the work that's been done over the past couple of centuries has shown that any way you try to define subspecies using phylogenetic systematics or evolutionary systematics or some other type of sort of prominent biological research program, it doesn't usually work too well for Homo sapiens, right?
Because we're a lot more mixed. We're not really.
Yeah, and we're a fairly young species. The mixture, we engage in a lot of interbreeding. That doesn't automatically sort of rule out with respect to some of these definitions, but it's just really hard, and it's really hard to get the sort of distinctions that life scientists used to think were there, right? So as life sciences has quite a history of really thinking that there's these huge substantive differences between the so-called races. And where I'm at right now, we probably had the most famous sort of life scientist pushing for that, Samuel Morton, right? So he was a craniometrist, which is a type of the phrenologist.
Bumps in your head.
The phrenologist, they're looking at the head. Craniometrists were trying to come up with sort of measurements of these mental capacities that phrenologists were studying. And one thing that Morton was interested in, he was a physician in Philadelphia, He was affiliated. He was an alum of Penn actually, and he got together a huge collection of human skulls, and he was a big proponent, supporter of Johann von Blumenbach, and Blumenbach, of course, he had one of the sort of most popular racial classifications using easy recognizable physical differences. He was a 1700s anthropologist. And so what Morton did is basically just took Blumenbach's racial classification of 5 races. It was Caucasians. Blumenbach created the term Caucasian. He said Ethiopians is really what we think of as black, but also including Melanesians and other black-looking people across the globe, like Andaman Islanders and so forth. And Mongolians, which is roughly East Asians, but also includes sort of Arctic Native Americans, and Malay, which is not really talked about today. It's kind of Austronesian speaking people, but also brown skinned sort of Pacific Islanders, and then what you call the Americans. And Morton really didn't do anything to sort of refine that racial classification of Blumenbach's. Blumenbach considers himself to have established it from looking at skulls. What Morton did was he developed a metric called Cranial Capacity, which is literally just finding the volume of skulls, right? Using different sort of methods. So he started off with seeds, and then he went.
Well, in all these classifications, there was a presumption of a hierarchy. Like there was one branch you want to be on, and so you're on the other ones, and neither you or me are going to end up on the good branch. We're going to end up on the wrong one, right?
Well, I don't know about that. So in Blumenbach's classification, I'm guessing South Asian ancestry is where you're. I'm sorry.
We're Dravidians, so we're either neglected and ignored, or
in Blumenbach's classification, you'd be Caucasian, right? And
well, I don't know him specifically. I do know that there's definitely a lot of Indian racism out there during this time too, especially with colonialism, right?
Right. Well, so you can always have intragroup sort of further distinctions, but in any case, so Morton. He uses his method. It seems to be scientifically objective. There were contemporaries who had questions, one of which was Charles Darwin. He thought that Morton's method was kind of shaky. But in any case, he was a very sort of respected physician in America. And he developed his hierarchy, right, where you had Caucasians at the top and the Ethiopians, a.k.a. blacks, at the bottom, down with Native Americans. And basically all it was just the volume of the average, the mean volume of the skull. So, I mean, that's
probably small sample sizes too, I imagine, right?
Oh, there's all kinds of concerns with
yeah, so even though, I mean, so we want to be careful here as we're talking about this for people listening in.
Yeah.
He had a classification that had different races with different intercranial brain sizes, but you don't want to actually believe that that's actually carried forward to now to say that certain races have different brain sizes on average.
Well,
and moreover, brain size doesn't actually correlate with intelligence.
I think that's the more important point, because we actually had some Penn anthropologists redo the skulls, because I know people have heard of Stephen Jay Gould's famous critique of Morton in Mismeasure of Man. And he made a couple claims against Morton, and we had some Penn anthropologists actually remeasure a large sample of the skulls. No one has measured all of them. You can't really measure all of them because some of them were given back.
There's also selection bias too, right?
Yeah. But there's all kinds of concerns there. There's sampling concerns, like where did he get these skulls? Are these representative? Right? There's deeper metaphysical concerns, like why even take Blumenbach's races seriously, right? Which is more my territory. And then could have been measuring biases, and it presumably was a lot of that. But in any case, that's a backdrop, right? And from that, you can actually you can see how contemporaries of Morton and folks later on who developed other methods really use this to justify colonialism and imperialism, right? It's like, well, look, the science says, the biological science says that we're at the top of the heap. It's not unimaginable that these people they're not just inferior to us, they're so inferior that they need some kind of help living, right? They need some help living, right? We can't let them just be free. So no, yeah, that was part of the dirty past of the life sciences and early anthropology and budding biology, um, and that's current life scientists. That you can imagine they don't want to get caught up in looking like they're contributing in any way to that history. Now there has been a bit of a resurgence into race research from life scientists today because um, kind of looking at it from a different perspective, and instead of trying to show that some groups are inferior with respect to intelligence, something like that, trying to show differences that might be able to help out with health disparities, right? So trying to focus on differences to help people instead of to hurt people, right? So that I think is a lot of the when you do see life scientists talking about race research today, that's where a lot of the
I mean, you see that though, but in the 70s, there were, I mean, Alan Templeton is one of those scientists, but there was actually a fair amount of debate that I think ended up being pretty healthy of actually really, hashing out what genetics is really telling us. And there's also some really important work that was done on chimpanzees that actually showed that chimpanzees as a control, right? Because if all you're doing is looking at humans, you don't really know like to what extent is that influence. So then when you kind of lay chimpanzees down alongside it, you find out that chimpanzees, even though they're in like a tiny geographic area, and even though there's so much fewer of them than there are of us, we actually see subspecies of chimpanzees. Like we actually see chimpanzee races.
Yeah, that's what Templeton has talked about. That was one of the things he talked about in that paper from that conference. It's interesting though because at that when I first saw Templeton present that, right? So you have like over a quarter of the genetic variation at that particular level where you're identifying chimpanzee subspecies. And for clarity, this is pan troglodytes, the common chimpanzee, right? Not bonobos. And you find like I think it's like 30.1% of the genetic variation occurs among the clusters. And so if you're clearing 0.25, you only need 0.25 to be a subspecies. And so you've got it, right? But now there were some systematists in the audience that were saying, well, those look like those things that you're calling subspecies look like perfectly good species to me, right? And
they're distinct species, yeah.
And so there were phylogeneticists, and which Templeton's not a phylogenetic systematist. He's he might use that language, but he's not a cladist, right, so to speak.
Well, he's kind of like an anti-cladist, but that's
yeah. But then we had some cladists, and they were like, no. You can use monophyly. You can work this up. You can identify these groups as.
But I think the whole point is the comparison is that let's even grant them that it really seems that chimpanzees really have distinct genetic types, and then we really should throw bonobos in there. I think what's so remarkable about bonobos is it's just a river that separates them.
But sometimes that's all it takes, right?
Well, not for humans. That's never been enough for humans, right?
Well,
there's no comparable case like that among humans where you have long-term genetic separation because of a river.
Right. I mean, but there's other geographic barriers.
Well, so the only real one that seems to be durable for potentially thousands of years is the Bass Strait between Tasmania and Australia, but that's not without dispute. So,
well, what about the Bering? So the I'm blanking, but
the Americas.
Yeah, the Americas. Yeah.
Well, there's also been really good evidence that there was continuous migration and cultural exchange through coastal routes and through the Bering Islands. There's a Bering Islands. I'm kind of
through the islands, really? Okay.
So I mean, it helps remember that Homo sapiens, humans, by that term, populate Australia. Actually, there were no Homo genus, I believe, in Australia until Homo sapiens got there. And that was 60,000 years ago. And the gap between Southeast Asia, even when the seas were lower, was never less than about 50 to 100. I mean, around 100 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that means like 60,000 years ago. And the estimates are to really get a founding population. You'd have like a few hundred people show.
Sure.
So that means that's pretty good reason to infer that they were able to actually cross large barrier. I mean, there's probably some sort
Oh
of
no,
boat.
we've been successful. Yeah. There's no.
And and so we're talking about like 60,000 years history of actually having something like a boat at least.
That's right.
And so to think that they wouldn't cross that, they could cross that barrier, but then they couldn't figure out along the coast to get to Americas. And then also there's evidence too of actual cultural exchange too. So it turns out that Americas were just never as isolated as people had thought. And like I said, the most likely one to be recently isolated is Tasmania.
Mm-hmm.
But just think about this conversation though. Compare that. We're talking on a global scale. We're talking about, okay, I guess there might be some evidence that Asia and America are kind of connecting. We're kind of wondering about this boundary case of Tasmania. But then for bonobos and chimpanzees, it's just a little tiny river.
That's right.
On one side,
Dahomey, something like that. Yeah.
And so there's just no comparison. I mean, this is like a place where we're just very different than like our closest relatives. They ended up being very geographically confined, and like simple barriers like that produce long-term separation, right?
That's right. I mean, humans are also interesting insofar as, I mean, if we don't want to interbreed with each other, even though we're right next to each other, we're pretty good at doing that also.
You think so?
With social isolation, yeah, sure. So, not that complete isolation, but the mere fact that you can identify genetic clusters of Native Americans and African Americans in the Americas is amazing, right? And how do you accomplish that? You can accomplish that with years of miscegenation, anti-miscegenation laws, and social taboos against interbreeding and things of that nature, right? I mean, think about, I was teaching philosophy of race. Is one of the courses I teach. I teach a race and biology, a philosophy of race, and some other philosophy of science courses. And we always have this section in my philosophy of race course on the interracial marriage rates in the United States. And so people are just amazed to find that like the rates are extremely low for many racial groups, African Americans, Asian Americans. We're talking about like 90%, 95%, intra-group marriage rates. That is astonishing, right? To be able to pull that off.
I do think that that's neglecting a piece of the puzzle, because reproduction doesn't always go along marriage, right?
Sure, but you can cross-check that with the census data on actual births, and the birth data matches the marriage data. Not to say that the births mostly happen within marriage. It's about a 60-40 split. But the sort of segregation patterns happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is one of those places too where I don't actually think the records. I mean, I think there's very good evidence when you start doing genetic testing that a lot of parentage, far more than you expect, isn't what actually is recorded. Mm-hmm. And especially when you start thinking about slavery in the United States.
Okay.
That's going to happen quite a bit when you have like a context of abuse or that's arising. So I mean, I'm just not sure. So I do think there will be a gap between the reality and what's reported.
Yeah, there's a gap, but so
we can. The thing about that's resolvable with data. But here's get to the core question that we find out. So I actually just got a note from NPR. I'm going to be speaking at NPR on Monday about race. It turns out.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the most important thing for people and the general public to know about the science of race and how we think about it?
Well,
what should I tell them?
You're talking to a pluralist, so I'm going to have a pluralist answer. When you're dealing with the kind of complexity, when you're dealing with race talk, especially among Americans, there's no simple answer. There's no single simple answer to give. So I like to have people narrow down the type of racial classification that we're talking about, right? Are we talking about people grouped by ancestry? Are we talking about people grouped by visible physical features, right? Are we talking about people grouped by culture, people grouped by socio-political standing, right? And you're going to get different sort of answers as to the importance of those racial classifications in different situations. Let me give you an example. So, as you may or may not know, the federal government has an official racial scheme. It's an ancestral racial scheme. I've argued that it's a genomic ancestry racial scheme. Some people disagree with that, but in any case, it's certainly ancestral. And it's very weird because we don't have an official language, but we have an official racial scheme, right? So there's whites, there's blacks, there's Asians, Pacific Islanders, and American Indians, and that's it. Hispanics, Latinos aren't a race; they're an ethnicity for the federal government.
And Indians were like the black Asians.
Indian. Yeah, I mean, like people I've talked to, various South Asian American, they mark multiple things, but usually Asian. Actually, there's an interesting demographic.
I gotta say, it's like an Indian. I do feel a little bit strange in some of these conversations growing up in America, because in some ways, I mean, we just have a weird spot. Or, I mean, I certainly am not black, to be very clear, or I'm not African American, right? But I mean, there's just, but I'm also not white, right? And I'm also not Asian, really. I'm not Chinese or
at least some more information typically needs to be communicated for people not to get the wrong idea or something like that, right?
Yeah, and I'm I'm ancestrally connected to 1 billion people, and somehow we don't appear on the ledger. I mean, that's a weird thing,
Yeah. So, but I mean, the way that you divvy up people in races matter. So think about what we were doing in the 2016 presidential elections. We were just using the federal government's racial scheme to racially sample Americans, plus a lot of political scientists were throwing in Hispanic or Latino as a race, right? Now, that's going to be useful if people are voting, if that's relevant information for capturing how people vote, right? But I gave a talk not too long ago where I showed how that broke down for Florida. So Florida, you've got lots of different Hispanic ethnicities, right? You've got lots of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, and so forth because of their proximity. And one interesting thing about Hispanic Americans is they're not like African Americans in terms of like they vote as a block. They're not a voting block.
So yeah, Cubans are very different than like Mexicans or
exactly, and that's what.
Even then, within each of those groups, there's going to be different constituencies as well, too.
Right, but I mean, it's different from Black Americans because pretty much the overwhelming majority of Black Americans, like well over 95%, are African American, right? So you don't get that same sort of substructure, right? It's more unitary in that respect.
There's also this issue with Hispanics as they get to like second or third generation, they just start to see themselves as white, and then
there's some data on that.
But African American, that doesn't happen. They see themselves as black, so it ends up being more of a durable category.
But it also depends on the subgroup. That's what I was, getting to. You pointed out the Cuban American distinction. It's like you start looking at like Pew has data and Census Bureau has data on sort of what people prefer to mark down, how they see themselves, and all this other stuff. And Cubans are different. Especially Cubans in Florida are quite different. And so
we got to back up though, because I think I don't want to get too off this topic here, because I think what's really helpful, I think, about the articles you write is you actually enumerate different precise definitions of race, both at the folk level and the biological level, and we can see how some of them and actually kind of having precision on a multitude of definitions is what you do, I would say. And that's helpful because then you can actually see, okay, maybe that one doesn't actually work.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that one does, but it also doesn't really justify this. And having kind of that clarity of that cataloged out. Can you just kind of as cleanly and directly as possible, list out some of these definitions of race. Let's start with just listing them out, and then maybe kind of go back and see, is there scientific legitimacy to that? Is there scientific legitimacy to that? And kind of go through that. So what are some examples? Can you just list out some of them?
So if you're starting with the biological stuff, so you've got the geographic subspecies definition.
That means that there's different subspecies that hail from different geographies.
Yeah, so it's a group of populations that have that are phenotypically similar, that occupy a geographic subdivision of the species, a biological species, and that are taxonomically significant, like from other such groups. So, so basically, you're looking out at.
Okay, so what are some other definitions? Let's go on.
Then there's Cladistic Subspecies. This is a monophyletic group of breeding populations in a well-defined species. Breeding population is a group of local populations that have reproductive ties with each other, and that are, for the most part, reproductively isolated from other such groups. So you're building up cladistic races from those. And then you got Templeton's, definition. It's the smallest level of populations in a species, for him, a cohesion species, that operates as a distinct evolutionary lineage. So those are some, I think, fairly carefully defined biological.
Those are three. Let's go through them. So the first one is a subspecies from different geographies. I think part of the issue is that well, I mean, to give some of the science here, one thing that we do, there's a couple things that we do see when we look at ancient DNA and DNA. One of them is that you see interbreeding by geography. So a distance diminished thing. So you go to any part in the world and you look at people there, you'll see that there's interbreeding that kind of falls off by distance. But there's a sharp border in most cases. I mean, there might be a couple boundary cases where you can see that lasting for a while. You can certainly see it arising for generations, but to see that over thousands of years or even hundreds of years is extremely rare. And generally you see kind of this fall off. So based on really kind of like where you geographically arose, just if you look at the distance, like the walking distance between two people, that's enough to give you about how much interbreeding there was. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that you also see a large number of large scale movements people in the past. And so when you talk about, for example, British people 10,000 years ago were different than the British people now. I mean, it's not the same people, and that doesn't just mean recent migration of immigrants. There's large migrations in the past where we've forgotten about, even like very large migrations in the past. There's a large number of historical events that we only know about through genetics, but you can see the clear signature there. So for example, about 4,000 years ago, it really seems like there was a large number of mariners from India or seafaring people from India that made their way all the way to Australia. And that's actually very likely where the dingoes of Australia came from, on ships and Indian ships. And we have no records of that. What we have is the genetics, and we have that's when like dingoes appear. That's deeply surprising. And
I mean, there should be some fossil record of that.
So the fossil. Well, you see the dingoes in the fossil record, right? But you don't actually see those people.
Okay.
You just see the genetics, and actually that makes sense. It turns out that the vast majority of remains don't fossilize, right? So
okay.
So you can have large amounts of stuff happening, but it'll just be in the blind spot,
right?
And and just like 4,000 years back, like I'm saying, that's not a very long time ago. And so we kind of have, I think, a bit of a naive perspective that we think that like global exchanges were only happening since the colonial era. And that sort of mixing on a global scale was only really started with colonialism and with modern transportation. And that just turned out to be true.
No, nobody thinks that.
Well, people do. Maybe not foreign people.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, some people still think the Earth is flat, but
so all of that kind of fits into this notion of. So if we take that, how does that kind of map onto those three definitions of race you gave? The first one was this regional subspecies one. It seems to really undermine the notion of regional subspecies, right?
Well, yeah. So those are some common objections in the literature. But once you look carefully at the nuances of definition, I don't think that history of widespread human interbreeding really undermines the existence of biological races in humans. According to these definitions, that's not to say there might not be other objections. But here's to step through a couple. For the the geographical subspecies one, a lot of it hinges on what counts as taxonomically significant, right?
Yeah. So what does that mean? That seems like it's very very sort of thing. We're not talking statistical significance. You mean more like taxonomically important?
Well, yeah. So I think there's some confusion that goes on there. Some people use this 0.25 cutoff when you're using,
which is arbitrary,
of variance or something like. Yeah, that's arbitrary. And I think, to be fair to Ernst Mayr, that really always was a measurement. You have to distinguish between measuring a property and the essential property itself, right? So the question of what is taxonomically significant shouldn't be confused with how we measure that, right? And how we measure it, we might have some arbitrary sort of cutoff or something. But this tradition of doing sort of geographic race research sprung out of, you have to think about its history, it sprung out of evolutionary biology coming of age.
Yeah, right? But I think it's interesting too. It also had to do, I think, with the limits of the technology at the time. So if you can only look, for example, at mitochondrial DNA,
okay,
you will get a tree because you're only looking at one loci.
Okay.
And we didn't actually have until very recently, meaning within the last 10 years, the capacity to sequence whole genomes at a large enough scale to do these types of studies, and B, and it turns out to be very challenging to be able to actually do the ancestral recombination graph reconstructions to actually to do that, because it turns out that every single loci in your genome will have a different tree.
Sure.
And so if you're only looking at one tree, or you have the ability to look at, then you're going to say, oh, humans kind of look like a tree. However, that was actually a technological limitation, because you could have seen coherence across all these different loci, always getting the same tree, except for we find out that they're all different trees.
So that's relevant to the genealogical notions like Andreessen's Cladistic Subspecies. I'm gonna get to that second.
Okay.
But with the taxonomic stuff, what they were trying to measure historically was incipient speciation, right? They were trying to make sense of how you get from one species to another. How does speciation happen, right? And there's a number of ways it could happen, right? It could be sort of quantum. You could just leap to another species, which sometimes happens if you have some kind of really weird sort of chromosomal events happen. It happens to plants
interference or strict isolation. There's also question.
But a lot of the thought back then was, no, this doesn't happen gradually, right? And then the question is, well, so what sort of stages do populations go through before they become new species? And the idea was there's a race stage, right? Now, the problem with that thinking was just because, something doesn't happen immediately and there's some sort of gradual sort of process of it, doesn't mean that there's sort of like a categorical distinction at any point in the process, right? And so they really could have just talked about population.
Is that a little related to like the parable of the sand Socrates paradox?
Could be. But I mean, that isn't, you don't need any fancy philosophy to really see this, though, right? I mean, you could have categories at some point in the gradual process if it's like helpful for remembering things and so forth. But it's quite a different thing to say that nature is creating that clustering in all such cases, right? But in any case, that was called the incipient speciations level, when you had populations on their way to becoming species, right? Species in the making. That's what subspecies was supposed to be. And so taxonomically significant was supposed to map onto that more qualitative distinction. But it's not clear that there was anything there in nature to pick out, right?
Yeah.
You could just talk about speciation just for population.
I mean, I gotta say that's also where I feel like Alan Templeton's throwing the chimpanzee races into it really helps, because that gives you a control to look at, right? I mean, humans populations are just different a lot of ways than other animals. I mean, obviously, I mean, we're animals too. You know, we have DNA. I'm not saying there's anything, you know, miraculous going on, but I am saying that there's just different dynamics with humans than there are with what you expect of most other animals. So,
yeah, and you know, I think Templeton does that because he wants to get sort of the emotion out of it, and you know, let's see if we can make this concept of race work on a species where we don't have to talk about, you know, police killings and racism, things like that. Let's just see if the biology works, and then if it works over there, can it be applied to humans? Right? I think that was the idea.
all right, so that's the first one, and we don't want to take too long each other because we want to give a chance for people to see it. So the second one,
so the genealogical stuff. So
second one is cladistics. So
yeah, so the and you know, you can lump Templeton in here too. He talks about lineages. It's not entirely clear what a distinct evolutionary lineage is. He has ways of measuring it, but you can still have some questions about when one arises metaphysically. But in general, the idea here is, well, at least you have something objective to track, right? So you're talking about gene lineages, but we're interested in you know, the organisms that those genes are in. And at least in the human case, where you don't have huge metaphysical questions about when an organism, you know, starts and when it dies. I mean, there's some things that we get into, but for the most part, they're not like some other like more problematic unicellular organisms. Then you get a tree, right? Or at least
if you look at one loci, if you look at more than one, you get different trees.
No. This is not tree in sort of a graph theoretic sense. Maybe I should be more careful. You get a connected graph, right? I came from two people. My parents.
Well, you got genealogically, yes. Okay,
exactly. Sure. So this is the genealogical web. Right. This is the genealogical tree that we have as a base for some kind of claim of objective classification of people into subgroups within our species. So that's where the clades get started. So the tree's there, right?
But I think it's not. I think that's actually a really important point. So you're saying the tree is there. That is the assumption of the cladistist. But our genealogical relationships are not actually a tree. They're a web.
I mean, yeah. This is
the assumption. And then if you look,
the connected graph is there. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you look at one loci, that's what you'll find out. It's just that if you look at multiple, then you see something different. And it was really for technological limitations. People were only looking at a single place.
Well, I mean, we want to be careful about distinguishing between organism trees and sort of gene trees, right?
Yes, so, I agree.
If you want to trace the genealogical histories of organisms, right? I mean, you can use genes as evidence of that, but really, you can think about if you had some omniscient sort of being stepping aside and just looking at who gave birth to who, there would be a connected graph.
Yeah, it would be a connected graph, but it wouldn't be a tree. You can't call it a tree.
But now, this is the idea of the cladis, zoom out even more. And do you see populations arising? Right? Are there huge branchings? This is what
well, I guess that gets to the point though, because if there's actually like interbreeding between all the groups, like on an ongoing basis, so then maybe you don't.
It's going to get messy. But this is exactly what Willy Hennig does in phylogenetic systematics, right? He actually doesn't start with organisms. He starts with organism parts. He calls semiphoronts. These are like parts of organisms through time, and they connect into an organism. Then you have the organisms. They give rise to other organisms. Then you zoom out even more. Then you get populations. You zoom out even more, you get species. But the problem is exactly what you said. So when you're zooming out to get to the population level, you got to be clear about what you mean by a population in order for that zoom out to actually be, let's say, an objective zoom out, that you're zooming out to something that's there independently of what you're studying.
Yeah, coherent.
Or it's just a easy sort of classification that you're using to handle very complex data, right? Because the problem, of course, that arises is you're going to get, like when you zoom out to these so-called populations, there's going to be interbreeding, right? And so the question is, well, how much destroys the population? Metaphysical question, right? How much interbreeding destroys the population? Depends on what you mean by population, right?
Well, I think part of it, though, is that a lot of these populations have been far more ephemeral than people thought, too, right?
Yeah, that can happen, too.
I mean, to be clear, when I say ephemeral, on the scale of a human lifespan, I mean, they could have been lasting for many generations. They could be lasting for centuries, or maybe even 1,000 years in some cases. That'd be rare. But like population distinctions lasting for tens of thousands of years, that's...
For our species, that's hard. That's hard to pull off.
I mean, I don't know if we've ever observed that.
I mean, it depends on what a population is, right? But you do hear population geneticists talk about, various extremely isolated groups that they have evidence. They say they have evidence that they existed for 10,000 years, not isolated for 10,000 years, but the population has been around for 10,000. Something.
Yeah, but that's actually changed in the last 10 years too, because the Andaman Islands is a great example. They did a whole bunch of studies on single loci that showed they were isolated. But then when they did whole genome studies, they found out, I guess they weren't isolated.
Sure. Yeah. No. I don't think any of the population geneticists I'm referring to would ever say that any human population has been isolated for 10,000 years, but it's existed for 10,000 years.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
To the metaphysics of, how much sort of, gene flow destroys a population, right? But in any case, once you do that, then you have these populations, and Andreessen says, well, now you might have monophyletic groups, and she defines them diachronically. An ancestor and all of its descendants is a monophyletic group, which that's another issue because people define monophyletic group differently, but that's what she uses.
That's a term I was so confused by. I screwed up in my book too, actually.
Well, there's
using it differently.
I mean, there's no widely. I mean, Hennig defined them by species, so you couldn't have monophyletic groups within species by definition because the units that would make up a monophyletic group were species, right?
Yeah.
So, and then there's a sort of contemporary group sort of definition in the diachronic. But in any case, if you have this now rough-looking tree, definitely connected graph of populations, right, that have ancestor-descendant relationships to one another, now you can just lump those units together into monophyletic groups and say, aha, now maybe I've identified some races in our species. But a lot of that hinges on what counts as a population in this respect.
When you actually look at the data, it looks like it's just recapitulating the map. You just see things that are spreading by geography. And then like I said, it gets more complicated when you look at ancient DNA. Then you just see even that falls apart. So, and once again, I think some of this stuff is actually very new. It's like within the last 10 years that people really figured it out. So what's the third one then?
So that was Alan Templeton's. So distinct evolutionary lineages, the smallest level. So say that you're within a species, a cohesion species for him, and then you can, for some species at least, you can identify these distinct evolutionary lineages, and then you can have different levels of that. So there could be distinct evolutionary lineages within distinct evolutionary lineages. And he says the smallest level. So the smallest level is a level of races, right? And it just so happens, as an evolutionarily contingent event, that we don't have that in our species, according to Templeton. And what that's hinging on is what counts as a distinct evolutionary lineage, which actually it's not that clear to me. But what he takes to be a good measurement of it is nested clade analysis. And for that analysis, I believe you can't have any statistically significant gene flow like over the course of time that you're looking at. And so according to that standard, there's no no distinct evolutionary lineages in the human species. We've already talked about our breeding history. But notice a lot of this hinges on the nuances of the features of important key terms in the definitions, right?
Yeah, there's another one that you did not actually mention, but I think it's worth including, because this conversation about race actually didn't begin exclusively in science. I mean, depending on how you want to look at it, but there's a really important book by La Pereire that was written about 500 years ago, which had really like the first time polygenesis is being considered, but it was from a theological point of view, and the way how he really defines it, in a lot of ways, are do you descend from Adam and Eve or not? And of course,
big debate. Yeah,
what's that?
That was a big debate.
Huge debate, and it's like the polygenesis versus monogenesis debate, right? Which, I mean, it's a very interesting history to follow, but I think what happens actually is that people thought that, well, if we all descend from Adam and Eve, then Adam and Eve have to be in the very, very distant past. So that's why even like Catholics go to like holding on to the doctrine we all descend from Adam and Eve, but that's fine. 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, whatever. That's where he was, right? So that way everyone still descends from him, right? But then, I mean, what we've also found too is that actually, even if they were very recent, we'd still all descend from them. I mean, we probably get DNA from them, but we'd still all descend from them.
Are you talking about the mitochondrial studies, the mitochondrial Eve and all that stuff? Or?
So it's a distinction between genetic and genealogical ancestry, right? So you're talking about like organismal history. Like, so for every single piece of your DNA, it only has one parent.
Right.
So it's going to be just a single line going up out of every individual and coalescing. But if you're talking about organismal reproductive history, then every single individual has two parents, never one.
Sometimes three now.
All right, let's yes, there's always exceptions in biology, especially when technology is involved, but let's just go with that. So there's always two, right? And so that creates a situation where you have like, instead of kind of fanning in, like for genetics, it's actually fanning out. So very quickly, like just a few thousand years back, we all share the same ancestors, like the exact same ancestors. It's we all descend from the same people on an organismal level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and there was clearly sort of the technical term inbreeding, right?
Yeah.
After you go back a certain number of generations, but yeah.
So it isn't really a scientific definition per se, to be clear, but I do think it's interesting because still there are religious people out there in the world, and that's how some people have thought about race. So then we've been talking for an hour. We could probably go on for a little while longer, but what are the ways then do you think that race does become important? Like, is there really such a thing as actual, is there really such a thing as black, or is it 100% purely constructed?
Well, now you get over to the folk conceptions, right? Because the biological conceptions of race haven't worked out too well for the human species. We talk about common chimpanzees, but we haven't behaved as well to get any kind of clear answers. So there's just a lot of debate about that. But I'll give you.
There isn't a clear scientific definition of race. That's what it means, though, right?
Well, no, I mean the definitions are there, but
we don't need
test them. When you test them with the human data, it's just really hard to find evidence according to the particular operationalized conceptions of some of those terms, like taxonomically significant, right? But with respect to the folk stuff, so another way you could bring biology in it is, okay, so let's forget about how biologists define race. How do ordinary people define race? And are there any of those meanings that actually is picking out something biological? Right. So you have this recent book by Michael Hardiman called Rethinking Race. And he argues that, there's a conception he calls a minimalist concept of race, which basically it's a group of people that are visibly distinct in a special way. That special way is it corresponds to geographic ancestry. It's heritable. All these sort of.
But we should be really careful here. So this is the part that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. So when you're saying that, is there any evidence that any of those groups are less human? Or,
No. He the
or
first chapter of his book is about how the way that he's articulating what he says is our concept of race, or our dominant, widely used in English language. He calls it the Millinous race concept. The first chapter, he's like, but this is what it's not doing, right? And it's not connected to that stuff. He calls that the racialist concept of race, where you're sort
is
of.
that just political correctness, or is there really some legitimacy behind what he's saying?
Well, no, I mean it's not just political correctness, because what he's trying to carve out is the minimum sort of properties you need to be a race according to our widest adopted.
I think this gets where I think your pluralism idea really helps, because his idea of race is totally different than what people would have thought of race 100 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I'm not totally different. What he would say is,
well, what is justifying segregationists, which is justifying all the scientific racism and all of that. It's not that. He's talking about something different.
It's not that. It's different, right? It's distinct, but they're related. So he would call that the racialist concept of race. So really quickly, I mean, he's got the visible physical features in race. He's got races have a unique geographic origin and their ancestry groups of some kind. That's a pretty thin notion, right? It's a notion that you can use, he says, to identify the groups that people were calling races back in Samuel Morton's day, but it's not thick enough to sort of justify the sort of stuff that Morton was talking about, right? So you don't get, like, by definition, right, huge significant differences.
Is that any different than like an ethnic group?
Yeah, it is for him, because one thing that comes out of his theory is Latinos or Hispanics aren't a race. They're not a minimalist race, partly because there's no distinctive visible physical features, right? So I could be Hispanic, you'd have no idea, right? I could be Dominican or something, you have no idea, right? But I'm not. Right?
So help me understand this. So this is like one of my most confusing experiences with race. It was in California. I was born and raised there. I visited.
What part?
Southern California. I went to school at UCI. It was Orange County and all that. And there isn't a lot of black people in Orange County, right?
Of course not.
Yeah, I mean, when I was there wasn't a lot of Indians either, man. Like, it was kind of, you definitely get something of a minority experience being an Indian in Southern California. Maybe it's a little bit different now, but that's how it was when I was growing up. But I remember I visited with a group, Watts, which is a really black area of Los Angeles. Right?
Oh, Watts, California. Yeah. I was born in Gardena.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. And we were helping at a food bank, and there was some like black kids that came up to me, and they asked if I was black. And I'm like, no, I'm not black. They said, oh, no, you're totally black. And I'm like,
did you have a hat on? Or...
And then I went back to like the guy who's running the food bank there, like the pastor. And he's like, no, you're black. And I'm like, I'm telling you, like, my world is like, I'm like confused. No, I'm actually from India. They're like, no, you're black. And it was interesting because they were working from some understanding. And of course, I don't think that, I don't know what's going on with the kids exactly, but I mean, he knew what an Indian was. And so, but in what, I still don't even know how to make sense of that. Can you make sense of that for me?
I'm laughing because I remember being at a conference once, and a philosopher told me that they mistaked me for a Dravidian philosopher. But once the person turned around, I mean, they could tell it wasn't because I didn't have the same face, but from the back, I don't know if she's wearing a hat or something. I don't know what was going on, but skin was dark enough for sure.
Hair is a for most people. I mean,
or you could have a low cut, like I keep my hair low. There's different ways. But yeah, that's happened to be in the reverse, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the part where it does make sense is that I have dark skin, and in a world that's really shaped by that, if I had been in the United States 100 years ago, I'd be living in a different area of the city. I wouldn't be allowed to live in certain areas of the city. I would be called, I would be on one side of the discrimination line or the segregation line, right? And no one would mistake me for white.
Mm.
So I think that part's the same, even though my ancestors didn't actually really go through that here. And then, I think one thing I actually have noticed is that there's been several times where people treated me different when they first, from a distance, thought I was Black. And then they got closer and realized that I was.
That's interesting.
And ironically, actually, with police officers.
How about that? I was about to ask you that.
The police officers in St. Louis, which has been totally disturbing to see that.
Mm.
And it's like, oh, okay, you're not actually Black. And that's not an experience I would have if I was white. So
you're saying that
I was wondering.
Sometimes the police.
It's been rare. I'm not trying to say this is all police officers, but there were a few distinct instances where it was just. I mean, I don't want to get into details right now. I mean,
Sure.
It was it's a bit too heavy to get into right now, and there was more than one instance too. And if you put out too few details, and people kind of question it, but let's just say that, like, I'm a smart guy. I have very good reason to think that was the case.
No, I'm thinking that this segues nicely into Sally Haslanger's definition of race for our. So she disagrees with Hardiman. Hardiman saying at the base of it, the most widely used meaning that we use ordinary folk is this thin biological concept. She disagrees and says, no, it's actually a socio-political concept, right? So for
that's
her,
it looks like to me, in the sense that I think that you can so I think most people would say that, like, a white person trying to just identify with Black culture and even look Black, that doesn't make her Black. And we can think of an individual who did that. I think most people would say that. I think most people would say, in very important ways, that I'm not Black.
Right.
And I agree with that. I'm not at all claiming to be Black. I'm just trying to tell you.
This is what Haslanger and some other socio-political constructionists would say. At that moment, you're Black, but you're mixed.
Yeah, it's like a mixed identity. Yes, there's a thing where it can be imposed on me, actually.
And that's what she thinks. She doesn't think that
that's actually been the bizarre thing about it, honestly, Quayshawn. When those instances happened, I realized that it doesn't actually matter what I think about my identity. It is what is being imposed on me entirely by just, like, the snap judgment of someone else.
So let me just lay out her definition. So she says, a race is a racialized group, and what a racialized group is a group that's perceived or imagined to have similar visible physical features that have some common geographic origin among the people who have those features. But they're actually essentially positioned as subordinate privilege along a social dimension, right? And so she's able to capture
African American, when you think about it.
Yeah.
African American is pretty dang diverse in Africa. I mean, Africa is very diverse.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's all grouped that way is interesting. And then also I think one of the more bizarre things I've noticed too, I mean, especially here being in St. Louis, is that African Americans are actually treated very differently and perceived differently than recent African immigrants.
Okay.
I've noticed at times. And also socially they track differently. So this doesn't make sense in terms of genetics.
Right. Which is why I think you need more than one meaning of race to make sense of the total phenomena. There's situations where Haslanger's account's going to work really well, but other situations where Hardiman's is going to work better, right?
Yeah. So I think this really creates a lot of complexity because we're academics. We actually care about the world as it really is, and it turns out the world is complex. But when you look at the conversation right now, it's complex, but it's also what gets the most attention are the simple things, like the simple stories. So I think that really creates a really challenging thing. When we have a complex world with complex problems, but people are only really prepared to engage them in simplistic ways, in ways that maybe aren't going to work as well. I think that really creates a big societal challenge, frankly, and how to work with this. And I guess the other thing I'd add too is that we think about inheritance in terms of genetics, but I do think that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about inheritance beyond just genetics, about how things carry over from generation to generation in ways.
Epigenetic culture, sure.
culture, or even just the way how systems are set up, and how even geography. It's interesting. You talk about geographically distinct spots. St. Louis is still a segregated city. We still have Black people in one area and white people in another. Is that because Black people are biologically drawn to one half the city and like the city, and then like white people are biologically drawn to the county? Of course not. It's because we had redlining here. We had we had steering. I mean, segregation is recently, and and that creates problems, and it separates people. And even in Ferguson, that's like the clash of of a Black community next to a white community that's transitioned to be more and more Black. And so there's these real social dynamics. So to say it's socially constructed doesn't mean that it's completely malleable or completely intentional. Even it just means that it isn't rooted in DNA often the way how we see the world.
Yeah. Except one thing that I have a bit of concern with some of the social constructions is how they sometimes oppose. They set things up such that they think they're opposing biology, when I think that a lot of times the two go hand in hand, right?
Well, I'm not sure about the social constructionist. I'm not quite as refined in all this. Maybe you can tell me what I am, but I'm not sure if I'm going that far, right?
Right, but maybe it wouldn't be, you wouldn't be that hesitant if the articulation of social construction were nuanced in a way that we would readily allow for things to be both socially constructed and biologically real.
Well, so it depends what you mean by biologically real. So first of all, I mean, I'm a medical doctor too. I'm a scientist, a biologist, but I'm also a medical doctor. It's very biologically real that North County, I'm looking out out the window of my office, North County has a higher rate of COVID-19, and that's where a lot of the serious cases are. It's like disproportionately affecting like the African American community, and they have less hospitals. That's biologically real,
right? And it can also be socially constructed.
Yeah, so I mean that's biologically, but it's not because there. I mean, at least maybe we'll find out. It's possible at this point we'll find out that that there's a slightly higher genetic susceptibility, but it's probably more likely to be explained by that there's more poverty there. There's more tight living situations. There's a lot of people who have to continue to work. A lot of them are working in food service. So they're still being exposed. And a lot of them have less healthcare and all that sort of stuff. That alone is enough to explain quite a bit. And that's probably the most likely explanation before we get to some like genetic mutation that's different, right?
Yeah, I mean, but there's been some studies, the NHS study coming out of the UK on Black British folks and Asian British folks and white British folks, and they controlled for like all the comorbidities that they could think of and all these other environmental variables, and there was still an effect, right? Statistically significant higher risk. So I mean, there could be something else going on. There's some talk about.
Well, I mean, that's a study that's still going to be subject to confounding variables, right? So,
it's always. I mean, you're never going to find.
That's actually a clear case where you expect confounding variables too. So, I mean, I don't think basically you can do that in a fully controlled way. Is what I'm trying to say. I don't think in principle you can. It just raises questions. I mean, the only way you can really show that it's related to biology would be actually showing a clear mechanistic connection to biology. That wouldn't be just a genetic association, but then you could actually do confirmation validation to show that, and that might be actually the case. But there's also all these other mechanisms that I just gave you that can explain all that you can't fully control for.
Right. Well, I mean, you can never fully control for confounders in human studies, right? Unless you want to do some very unethical controls. Right?
Yeah, well, that's the point. I mean, I'm just telling you that these things are. I mean, you can't just. Yeah, I mean, I believe that all the data they collected, they did the best job they could at controlling it. Right. But I think in this particular sort of question, from a technical point of view, you can't fully control for it. And so,
Right.
so if you see something statistical, you're still left with, is it confounding non-biological factors or is it a biological factor? And to really establish it as a biological factor, you have to do those extra steps.
Yeah, I mean, and even that's not enough, right? Because you can have other mechanisms that are underdetermining the mechanism that you're focused on.
Well, sure, yeah, that's not going to rule out the other factors. But we're kind of getting into the weeds here, just to say that yeah, I'm just saying, even if you take out the genetic differences out of it, yeah, the fact that it's constructive can lead to very biologically real differences. That's biologically real. I mean, it's something we're observing that's biological, like infection rates. It's real. I mean, and to say that that's not real is to be in a different world, like in a different planet, right?
Which philosophers are known to travel to sometimes with thought experiments. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you that there is a reality in that sense. I mean, another great example is certain medications, especially for blood pressure. This is a place where some really well studied. There's certain medications, recommendations are different if you're white or if you're black.
That's still going on?
Well, it has to do with, where there's evidence that, with ACE inhibitors that it just works different between.
Oh, you're talking about the Bidil
stuff? Renal insufficiency down the line and things like that. And so there's a difference, right? And that probably is partly genetic. But I mean, that's not anything related to all the historical reasons people thought about race. That's another case where it might have some reality to it. But even then, I think that is a problematic way to think about it, because you have all these boundary cases. What do you do with a person who's half white, half black? What do you do with a person who is, just looks black from a distance?
Well, so that's what sometimes people get caught up on. So you could study phenomena and use racial classifications in biology and genetics and medicine in pretty, productive, useful ways, and still not, support robust use of racial classification in treatment in clinical settings, right? Because there, what matters most is the independent, like the individual person's independent properties, right?
So the issue is that the challenge has been, and hopefully that's going to change as we understand more of the genetics of these things. Mm-hmm. But one of the serious issues we've had is that there's some things we could see were correlated to a folk understanding of race, but we didn't understand the underlying mechanism well enough to go off anything more than the proxy. So until we got that thing understood at a mechanism level better than the proxy, then we have a problem. That's just one of the challenges that we have, and I mean, hopefully the progress will help, but maybe not. I mean, this is one of those things where it's just tricky. But it gets to this challenge about, I would say, is that we have a very hard time in a charged area like race talking in a healthy way about our common humanity, in addition to real differences. It doesn't mean just biological differences, just real differences. It's just hard to talk about. Like we don't do a good job at that. And you seem to be pretty comfortable talking about it, but it's giving a lot of people the willies, man. You know that.
Well, when my students sign up for like my courses, they want to talk about that stuff. But what I usually notice is they don't really have a sense of what sort of tools are needed to talk about it constructively. And that's where we teach them things like the distinctions between valid and invalid deductive arguments. Basically, I give them a little baby logic, teach them how to construct arguments, focus on the argument, not the person, no ad hominem attacks. So this is like the opposite of Facebook and Twitter, right? People are just like taking hits at you. I know your mama and your mama. It's like, look, that has nothing to do with the proposition that this person is trying to convince you of. Focus on the arguments. And then once you isolate the premises, you can see, well, does this person have enough evidence for this premise? What type of premise is it? Is it a priori or is it a posteriori, right? Which means, is it in
light of evidence, or
in light of experience, or in light of something that's not based in experience, like math or logic.
Sure.
So once you give them those tools, those distinctions, by the end of the courses, I mean, they're very comfortable talking about extremely controversial things. But the problem is, I think that the American public is just undereducated on the sort of critical thinking and critical reasoning skills that it takes to engage in these discussions productively.
Well, there's that, but I also do wonder, when there's also a history, right, of abuse, where people, I mean, the way how racism works, it picks in on any difference, no matter how tiny, and it just puts a spotlight on that and it essentializes it, and it makes that justification, even if it just falls apart based on logic, right? And so it does make sense in that context that people are concerned about discussing differences in the fear that
right,
right?
I mean, but that's the reason why it has that uptake, is because there aren't enough people to spot the BS, right? if you can spot it, if you are trained in spotting that, right, I can immediately see when someone's like dishing me some BS on something about race, right? A lot of Americans don't have that skill, right? And so they can easily get caught up in buying into it, right? And on various sorts of, like, even when people are doing productive things, there is such thing as sort of good propaganda, right? So there's propaganda all over the place, but I really think that if people sort of had better critical reasoning skills, the topic, even though it's controversial, there's nothing really to fear in terms of having so many people believe false things pretty easily if we're pretty good BS detectors, right?
Well, yeah, so that could only be said from within the confines of a philosophy department. I'm just playing. I mean, unfortunately, the world is not full of academics. But I do think that these sorts of conversations are important. I really want to thank you for coming here and sharing with us. We've gone for about an hour and a half, and I really appreciate it. I really learned a lot, both from talking to you and also from those articles, which I highly recommend. I think kind of engaging the complexity of this is going to bring us into engagement with really interesting science, important ways to think more critically, as you're talking about. And I think that goes for both scientists and also members of the public too, not just philosophers. I think that's what's so interesting about your work too, is it's kind of engaging those larger questions. And I mean, fundamentally, I think we do need to get to a place where we can talk about differences in a meaningful way. And to do that in a way that that doesn't immediately go to saying difference means one is better than the other. I'll just end with one thought, and I'll give you the last word. I think one thing that's actually been really helpful for me as I've even thought about this too. This isn't the world we inhabit, but if you go to Star Trek during the 60s, you see like the way they imagined the universe is with different races on different planets, right? With disconnected origins, so they could still kind of breed. And I think it was actually fairly intentional that William Shatner was going out, breeding with all the women, like, because it was kind of like completely destroying this notion of like, okay, so even if races were created separately or whatever, even if they are really real, they're just like us. They're equally, I mean, they have equal human rights and dignity, even though they're different. And he's kind of going directly to that place where we normally call it bestiality or whatever, or like, miscegenation. And that's actually where during the 60s, in that moment, that's what's going on in Star Trek. And I think that's actually a really good reminder about, I mean, first of all, that's not the world we live in. It's not that, there's nothing like a Klingon here on Earth. We're all Homo sapiens, right? But even if there was different species of humans on Earth, that wouldn't actually be justification for racism anyways. That judgment, that value judgment about saying that this one is better than that one, is not something that really comes from science. That comes from other places in our hearts. Does that make sense?
No, that's what we call the is-ought distinction in philosophy. So no matter how many true propositions about the world you give, it doesn't follow that something should be the case, something ought to be the case, something's good, something's bad. These normative terms have a different basis. And I'll throw out a shout out to Brian Donovan, who's an educational sociologist, has been working on some interesting stuff where he's shown that, yes, actually just looking at reading and studying and talking about race, talking about genetic differences in terms of race can lead to, upticks in racist attitudes and problematic beliefs. But what he found, and what I think you'll appreciate, is that one of the biggest protectors against that effect is education in genetics. And I would hope that you continue to do studies and find that education in philosophy and logic is protective. I'm going to keep pushing him on that. But I think education is the way out for a lot of the problems that we see associated with talking openly and honestly about racial differences.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. This is Peaceful Science. This is we're kind of kicking off our podcast, so really subscribe. If you're a listener and you really felt this was interesting and worth following, send this to your friends. I mean, this is like a reasonable conversation on race between a scientist and a philosopher. How many people are having that conversation right now in our society and could benefit from that? And really kind of join the conversation with us at Peaceful Science as we consider that grand question together. What does it mean to be human? Thanks a lot, Dr. Spencer.